Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're plunging headfirst into one of life's most fundamental, often bewildering questions. Who am I? And maybe just as importantly, who are you?
Right. It's a question we all sort of grapple with, don't we? Often instinctively looking inward.
Exactly. Assuming there's this stable, private, maybe even unchanging self just waiting to be discovered.
Right.
Like finding a treasure map to our true identity.
What's truly fascinating, though, and maybe a bit disorienting, is that this very notion, this really deeply ingrained idea of an inner self or a private self, well, it isn't actually a universal human experience.
Really? So it's not something innate?
Not necessarily timeless, no, not
Yeah.
something always present across every culture or historical period. It seems to be distinctly Western and, surprisingly, a quite modern construct, historically speaking.
That's such a powerful starting point. It immediately makes me wonder, well, if this inner self isn't universal, what was the main way people understood their identity in, say, ancient Rome? And that's precisely our mission for this deep dive. We're going on, I think, a truly fascinating historical journey, tracing the roots of how our understanding of self has transformed over centuries.
Yeah, exploring how identity isn't just something you find, like some hidden artifact.
Right. It's actively constructed almost like a masterpiece,
Yeah.
built over generations, shaped within very specific social and historical contexts. Think of it as this ongoing, dynamic process, not some static destination you just arrive at.
And our foundational text for this exploration, it comes from the Handbook of Identity Theory and Research, which gives us a really rich, guiding framework to unpack these complex ideas.
Okay.
It really highlights how our sense of self isn't, a natural object, but is constituted by practices that vary historically and culturally.
Now, for many of you listening, especially those deeply involved in elementary education or psychology, this deep dive feels incredibly relevant.
Oh, absolutely.
Understanding how identity is built, how it shifts and evolves, well, it can profoundly inform how we see our students, how they interact in the classroom, and crucially, how we foster self-awareness in them.
It's about recognizing that every child's sense of who they are is this living, breathing thing, constantly being shaped by their experiences and interactions.
Yeah. We'll tease out some surprising shifts, I think, from the ancient world's public masks all the way to the vast, almost infinite inner mansions of memory that we carry today.
And we'll see how seemingly small everyday interactions, even those quick exchanges on the playground or the quiet moments of reflection in a classroom, play this massive formative role in shaping who we think we are.
Okay, so let's begin our journey back in time.
Let's do it.
Okay, let's unpack this fascinating idea that our very concept of who we are actually have a history. We often think of our identity as this solid, unchanging thing, right? Something intrinsic, almost hardwired into us from birth.
Right, like it's just there.
But the sources immediately challenge that assumption, showing us it's far more fluid, much more of a dynamic creation.
What's striking here is how the very idea of identity isn't some fixed natural object that we simply discover, but rather it's profoundly shaped by what people do and how their cultures operate across different times and places.
Okay.
Our journey begins really with the Greco-Roman world, where the term persona first emerges in a way we'd start to recognize. It has this dual meaning that still echoes today.
So if we look at persona, mask, and true nature, the core idea is that in ancient Latin culture, persona originally referred to a theatrical mask,
Yeah,
like the ones actors wore on stage.
exactly. Or a ritual role in a ceremony. It was a way to signify someone's status, their rank, or their ancestry. You literally wore a physical mask or took on a very public role to show who you were to others. It was very much an outward-facing thing. But this concept, it evolved pretty quickly beyond just a literal mask. It came to also mean the true nature of the individual, their inherent character, their disposition, and even, for freeborn citizens, a legal right to their own person. So this established a critical duality that became foundational.
A duality. How so?
Well, the self as a public presentation, the mask you wear, the role you play, sometimes even involving strategic public display or, even a kind of acceptable trickery or hypocrisy to navigate social situations.
Right.
And simultaneously, the self as a private, true essence, something perhaps more authentic beneath the surface, you could imagine a Roman senator presenting this perfectly composed, authoritative facade in the forum, while maybe privately grappling with anxieties about his family or finances. That dual meaning was already present.
And this wasn't just some abstract philosophical concept, was it? It was deeply tied to power.
Oh, deeply. The sources make it clear that slaves, for instance, had no personality in this sense.
Not at all.
They were considered property, not persons. And critically, they had no legal rights to their own body or actions. This vividly illustrates how identity isn't some universal inherent trait. It's integral to power relations and social structures.
Wow.
Your very personhood, your right to even have a true nature, was determined by your place in society, by whether you were free or enslaved.
That's a crucial point. It wasn't just a label. It dictated one's entire existence and capabilities.
Exactly.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture for, say, an elementary education setting, you can really see how even young students might exhibit different personas, can't you?
Oh, definitely. Think about how a child might act very differently during a formal presentation, like show and tell. They put on that public persona, maybe more confident, more articulate, eager to please the teacher, versus how they behave during free play or quiet reflection time. That's when you might see more of their true nature come through, their genuine interests, maybe their quiet anxieties or their unguarded imagination.
Right. So as educators, acknowledging and gently navigating these different masks lets us see the whole child.
Precisely. We learn to understand that their behavior is often a performance for a particular audience or context. It helps us not mistake the mask for the entire individual.
And then we can create a space where they feel safe enough to lower their masks occasionally.
Exactly.
That's a powerful distinction, recognizing the public mask versus the private self. But what happens when people start thinking about improving that true nature? That brings us to the Stoics, right?
Well,
and their, somewhat surprising approach to self-improvement.
Yes, moving on, Stoicism and self-improvement as social practice really builds on this. Roman Stoic philosophers, figures like Seneca, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, they significantly enriched the concept of the person.
How so?
For them, a person wasn't just a legal subject, but also a subject of moral conscience and free will. They had agency.
Okay.
And they believed strongly in self-improvement through what they called practices of the self. This meant strict daily routines and regimens.
Like what kind of things?
Well, carefully chosen diet, regular exercise, or even specific meditation techniques focusing on logic and reason, all aimed at strengthening one's will and character. For instance, a Stoic might intentionally expose themselves to minor discomforts, like a cold bath or a very simple meal, not for penance, but to train their mind to be resilient against fate's greater challenges.
So it was about building resilience.
Building virtue and resilience in the face of an unpredictable world, preparing the inner self for external trials.
But here's where Michel Foucault offers a critical insight that really shifts our perspective, doesn't he?
He does. Foucault argued that while these were indeed practices of the self for self-care and cultivation, they were not self-analysis designed to reveal some hidden inner truth or a metaphysical soul in the way we might think about therapy today.
Ah, okay. So not introspection as we know it.
Not quite. This self-improvement was fundamentally a social practice, aimed at achieving virtuous conduct in the public sphere, at being a good citizen and a resilient individual. You weren't digging deep to find a secret hidden self. You were shaping yourself to be a better, more virtuous participant in the world around you for all to see.
That has direct relevance to teaching, I think. How do we foster self-improvement in the classroom? Is it solely through external rewards and punishments, like, a sticker chart for good behavior?
Or is it about encouraging internalized discipline? Think about teaching study habits or conflict resolution. Initially, a teacher might give explicit rules for group work or how to handle disagreements. Those are external controls.
Right.
But the ultimate goal is for students to internalize these as practices of the self for improved character and behavior. We want them to develop self-regulation, to understand why these practices, like taking turns or active listening, are beneficial for their own well-being and their interactions.
Not just to avoid getting into trouble.
Exactly. It's about cultivating that inner monitor so they choose good behavior because it's the right thing to do, not just because they'll get a treat or avoid a consequence.
Now, despite these rigorous practices of the self aimed at character building, there's still intense debate on the ancient inner world, isn't there? It's not universally agreed upon when our modern concept of an inner self, that distinct private realm of thoughts and feelings, truly emerged.
Indeed. There's quite a bit of scholarly debate. Christopher Gill, a prominent classical scholar, argues that ancient thought, particularly up until around 200 AD, was primarily objective participant.
Okay, objective participant. What does that mean exactly?
It means your identity was mostly defined by your public role, how you behaved in society, your place in the community, not so much by your private thoughts or secret feelings, your job, your family, your citizenship. Those were yourself.
So actions over inner states.
Largely, yes. The goal was virtuous conduct aligned with universal reason and objective ethical norms, not delving into subjective emotional states. A Roman would typically ask, what is my role here, and how can I act virtuously according to established principles, not how do I feel about this inside?
That distinction really helps clarify it. So it was about living well outwardly, not necessarily feeling well inwardly.
Richard Sorabji, another highly respected scholar, offers a compelling counterpoint. He suggests that ancient Greeks did have an understanding that included both public and reflective inner aspects.
Okay.
He points to an intense preoccupation with the idea of me and me again, implying a continuity of identity over time that required some form of internal reflection, a basic recognition of one's continuous subjective experience.
Interesting. So there's evidence for both sides.
Definitely. And a crucial text in this debate, one the sources highlight, is Marcus Aurelius's Meditations.
Ah, yes. The emperor philosopher.
Right. While it's largely objective participant, filled with lists of public debts, stoic principles, duties for ruling an empire, it does contain descriptions of retreating into his own mind for quiet and privacy.
Really? He talks about that.
He does. Aurelius writes, and it's a powerful line. Nowhere does a man retreat into more quiet or more privacy than into his own mind.
So there is a glimpse of interiority there, a real moment of turning inward.
There is, but it's a very specific kind of retreat, isn't it? Aurelius emphasizes that this retreat was brief and fundamental, meant only to send you back without repugnance to the life to which you return.
Ah, so it wasn't about exploring the inner world for its own sake.
Exactly. He even refers to this self within as a little domain, making it clear that it was seen as insignificant compared to the importance of public conduct and duty. It was a tool for public efficacy, not private discovery, a quick recharge to be better at your public role.
Right, not a destination in itself.
And Mikhail Bakhtin, the literary theorist, he supports Gill's view, arguing that the translation of whole spheres of existence onto a mute register and into something that is, in principle, invisible, well, that was far from completed in ancient times.
Okay, what does he mean by mute register?
He means the ability to express thoughts and feelings without the external mediation of official ideologies or public forms. That wasn't yet fully present. So while ancient people certainly had thoughts and feelings, the recognition and articulation of them as a separate, private inner world, something in principle invisible to others, was still very much developing. They simply didn't have the cultural machinery or the language for it yet.
That makes a lot of sense. To create and express this burgeoning private world, this mute register, a new kind of language was needed. Which leads us, I suppose, to the birth of private language and the autobiographical self.
Exactly. Bakhtin identifies 3 key modifications to literary and autobiographical forms in the Hellenistic and Roman period that facilitated this crucial development.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first was the use of satirical or ironic treatments. Since there were no official public forums for private topics, no established genres for expressing deep personal sentiment or critique without being overtly political,
Right.
these emotions were expressed by parodying public rhetorical forms and heroic storytelling styles. Irony and humor became this clever way to articulate personal sentiments and subversive ideas without openly challenging official styles or risking severe repercussions.
So, like a loophole. A way to hint at things you couldn't say directly. Like maybe a poet writing a funny story about a lazy hero to subtly mock the grand Roman ideals.
Precisely. It allowed for plausible deniability. It was an indirect, often subversive form of communication. The second modification was through familiar letters.
Like personal letters.
Exactly. Think of Cicero's intimate, often unguarded letters to his trusted friend Atticus. These weren't public proclamations or formal treatises. They developed a private style of writing and speech for expressing thoughts, feelings, anxieties, even gossip, things not suitable for public forms. Foucault even called these technologies of self because the very act of writing these letters, articulating one's thoughts for a trusted recipient, was a technique for shaping and understanding one's private self.
So writing it down helped create the feeling.
In a way, yes, turning feelings into coherent expression. You couldn't just think it. Writing it down, even privately, made it more real, more defined.
And the third modification.
That was the Stoic autobiography, including Seneca's letters and Marcus Aurelius's meditations, which we discussed, and later, crucially, Christian literature like St. Augustine's Confessions.
Right.
These texts began to reflect elements of private thoughts and feelings, moving beyond just a public defense of a life's works or achievements. They started to show internal wrestling, moral dilemmas, emotional struggles, even if still framed within a larger philosophical or theological context.
So these developments, they heralded a really new form of self-relation, didn't they? That inaudible inner conversation.
Yes. The one that G.H. Mead would much later equate with the social self, that ongoing silent dialogue between the I, your spontaneous acting self, and the me, your socialized self, formed from internalized societal expectations.
And Foucault saw writing as key to actually creating this private sphere, not just reflecting it.
Exactly, bringing it into being through the act of articulation.
So to summarize this foundational period, we see the dualistic person, public mass, private essence. We see parody and satire emerging as tools for expression. We see the familiar letter creating an intimate space, and the beginnings of written self-reflection.
These are the faint beginnings, yes, of a mute, invisible core of the self with which we have a private, reflexive relationship, a shift from purely external validation towards the seeds of internal experience.
Which brings us to a truly pivotal figure in this journey, Augustine's turn inwards.
Ah, Augustine. Many scholars, like Charles Taylor, see his Confessions from 397 AD as a critical precursor to the modern self.
Why is it seen as so important?
He established the inner nature of the human soul and of God as intertwined, exhorting people to look inwards for truth rather than outwards to objective principles or public approval. It was this profound theological justification for introspection.
And Paulina Reams highlights Augustine's novelty, particularly his linking of memory. How did that work?
She points out his unique link of memory seen not just as storage, but as an infinite resource to the temporal generation of the soul, starting way back in infancy. This was a significant departure.
How so compared to someone like Aurelius?
Well, unlike Aurelius, who began his autobiography by placing himself in a fixed lineage or status, Augustine began his story with his birth and childhood, detailing his early sins, struggles, development. It marked a highly personalized memories approach. He saw the self as molded by experience over time, open to change and spiritual growth.
And his metaphors for this inner world, they're quite something, aren't they?
Incredible. He talks about fields and vast mansions of memory, measureless plains and vaults, describing them as his mind, which is nothing other than my very self. It's such a stark contrast to Aurelius's contained little domain.
It sounds huge, almost infinite.
Exactly. And a new meaning of privacy emerges here, too. Recognizing a phenomenal world of thoughts and feelings distinct from the real, tangible world, a world that can be hidden from others, known only to the individual and God. This concept of an internal realm that is profoundly private and potentially vast was pretty radical for its time.
And it's worth noting briefly that literature from Anglo-Saxon England from the 6th to 11th centuries also shows hints of this, right? Inner scrutiny, conflict, hiding turmoil.
Yes, things like The Wanderer, that old English poem where the narrator grapples with deep personal sorrow and isolation, choosing to keep his suffering to himself. It suggests a continuity in the development of a private self, even across that long period between Augustine and later shifts. It wasn't just one moment, but a gradual, evolving process.
Okay, so we've moved from the public persona of ancient Rome with only faint echoes of interiority to a significantly more developed inner world with Augustine, this vast landscape of memory and self-reflection.
But the split between outer presentation and inner experience is about to become much more pronounced, even a source of tension and critique as we step into the Renaissance.
Here's where it gets really interesting, I think, especially for those of us thinking about performance, authenticity, the roles we play in daily life, even in a classroom.
Exactly. The 16th century sees this profound shift in how identity is understood, almost as if society itself decided to take to the stage.
Right. And while René Descartes is often credited with putting subjective knowledge, the I think, therefore I am, at the center later.
In the 17th century, yeah. It's just before him that literary styles and social practices really start to emphasize this division between the public role and the private experience.
Absolutely. This is critical for understanding our modern sense of self and that increasing value we place on sincerity over just, performing.
Which brings us to unmasking pretensions. Folly, satire, and power shifts. Literary styles like parody and satire, often using folly as a trope. Think of Erasmus's praise of folly.
A class. They were used to create entirely new attitudes about the self. They sharply highlighted that growing public-private division we've been tracing, often using humor and absurdity to point out where things weren't quite right.
And Bakhtin and Norbert Elias show how the mask of folly was cleverly used to unmask the pretensions of the ruling classes.
How did that work?
Well, it subtly questioned their status and the very grounds of their power, which was often based on inherited wealth or rigid social hierarchy, not necessarily inherent worth or genuine competence. Think of a court jester playing the fool, who could speak uncomfortable truths to a king that no one else dared to utter.
Ah, okay. So the fool could actually be quite insightful.
Extremely. This led to a radical idea, judging individuals by their inherent worthiness, by their character and actions, rather than just their office, rank, or outward display of wealth. It shows how changing notions of identity are deeply linked to power struggles between different social groups and classes.
This feels directly applicable to a classroom context. How might a class activity, like a role play or maybe a debate, inadvertently reveal a student's true understanding or feelings beneath a performance of knowing?
Oh, that's a great point. A student might be playing the part of someone who gets it, nodding along, but a debate forces them to articulate their actual knowledge, potentially unmasking any pretension or maybe revealing deeper insights they hadn't shared.
Or how does satire in literature, even age-appropriate examples, like fables that cleverly critique human behavior, teach critical thinking about societal roles and appearances?
Right. Encouraging students to look beyond the surface, to question authority or social norms. It's about developing that critical eye for performance and authenticity in others and themselves.
Okay, moving to the multi-layered self and the theatrical metaphor, the diversification of language in everyday life, what Bakhtin called heteroglossia. That sounds complex.
It just means the coexistence of different linguistic styles, dialects, social languages within a single national language. Think of all the different ways people talked: commoners, nobles, merchants, clergy. This linguistic richness led to the novel representing a much more multi-layered, multifaceted self.
So the self became an object of others' gaze and a subject of its own gaze.
Exactly. And this really widened the division between public and private self, emphasizing that inner, mute, and invisible sphere. Individuals were no longer just unified characters defined by social categories. They became psychologically complex, full of contradictions, hidden depths, internal conflicts.
A big shift from the ancient world.
Huge. And literary types like the clown, the fool, the rogue, they acted as powerful masks that also, paradoxically, unmasked. They ridiculed official life and found these unofficial, often funny or cynical, ways to express private experiences and dissenting views.
And this period saw a growing concern for sincerity, right? Opposing false social displays.
Yes, a real opposition to perceived hypocrisy. The literary critic Lionel Trilling noted this emerging obsession with deception and pretense, a deep anxiety about appearances versus reality. People started scrutinizing others and themselves for signs of true character versus just role-playing.
And nothing captures this theatrical worldview better than Shakespeare, surely. All the world's a stage.
And all the men and women merely players, all have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts. Perfect. It captures that sentiment that identity isn't always stable. People play many parts, shifting roles depending on the context. Identity itself becomes like a series of performances.
And Shakespeare was influenced by Erasmus, the humanist.
Deeply. Erasmus similarly wrote about life as a sort of comedy, in which the various actors, disguised by various costumes and masks, walk on and play each one his part.
That theatrical metaphor is extremely powerful for elementary education, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Students often play parts: the eager learner for one teacher, the mischievous friend for another, the responsible group leader, the shy observer.
Right. We can discuss how classroom roles like student, leader, helper are parts they play, and how different situations call for different performances.
And the key question becomes, how can we encourage students to be sincere in their interactions, rather than just performing for approval? This helps them understand social dynamics and the importance of authenticity, bringing more of their genuine self to their roles.
Learning to be discerning about their own and others' masks, which leads us naturally to humanism, education, and internal control.
Right. Humanists like Erasmus advocated independent study of primary Latin and Greek texts, including the Bible. This meant bypassing established authorities like the church or feudal lord.
Which was revolutionary in itself.
Absolutely. It empowered individuals to seek truth for themselves, challenging the monopoly on knowledge.
And they argued authority should rest on inner qualities, not just status.
Exactly. Qualities cultivated through education and moral discipline, not external wealth or inherited position. Erasmus mercilessly mocked pompous authorities who confused their titles and fancy robes with their actual duty.
Like kings more interested in themselves than the public good.
Precisely. He saw that as a failure of inner cultivation, a failure to inhabit their roles with sincerity and moral purpose.
His treatise on civility in children illustrates this too, right? Seeing outward behavior as reflecting the inner person.
Yes. He praised manuals that indicated a cultivated, self-controlled character, arguing individuals should be changed not only externally, but internally as well, through proper training. He disliked manners that were just staged to impress.
So it was about developing an internal sense of propriety.
That then manifests externally, yes. But what was truly radical about the humanists' contribution was this advocacy for a fundamental shift from external to internal social controls.
Okay, explain that shift.
No longer was society primarily controlled by the external physical threat of punishment or overt rules from above. Instead, the refinement of the invisible inner world was to be achieved through rigorous training and education. Individuals were now expected to control their own actions, gestures, impulses without constant external policing.
Wow, that requires a lot of self-awareness.
It required a profound, reflective relationship with the self. Monitoring and judging your own actions, words, even subtle expressions within specific social contexts. It wasn't just simple behavioral learning, it was cultivating an internalized sense of judgment and modulation, learning to read subtle cues, shifting conflicts onto an inner plane of thought and self-regulation.
This is such a core idea for educators. Facilitating that shift from external classroom management rules, rewards, punishments, to internal self-discipline.
Exactly. It's about cultivating that inner person through education, encouraging self-reflection, helping students understand why certain behaviors are valuable for themselves and the community.
Not just what behaviors are expected, like helping a child reflect on why they shouted out, not just punishing them for it.
Precisely, helping them find internal strategies. This ultimately works to create a soul, or self, with its own sense of interiority and control of impulse, a truly internalized moral compass.
And Charles Taylor, the philosopher, synthesizes this beautifully, doesn't he?
Yeah.
He suggests we don't have to choose between Augustine's inner life and Erasmus's public conduct.
Right. He argues that together, they gave the modern West the essential elements of A, self-exploration, B, self-control, and C, personal commitment over mere social conventions. These three pillars, built on that emerging internal self, became the core of our modern Western being.
Making the interior self paramount. Okay, so from the public stage of the Renaissance, we move into the marketplace and the world of social interaction, where that inner conversation becomes central to how we see ourselves through others' eyes.
Exactly. It's a fascinating journey into how society literally shapes our inner world.
Now, if you're thinking about how students learn to interact, to empathize, even regulate their own behavior in a busy classroom, those moments where a child maybe hesitates before acting out or decides to share this next section feels incredibly relevant.
It dives into how our internal thoughts are shaped by the external social world and how we become our own internal critics.
This raises an important question then. How does that inner conversation develop? How do we start internalizing those societal expectations?
Adam Smith, a key figure of the Scottish Enlightenment, gives us some really profound insights here. Insights that lay the groundwork for modern social psychology, especially symbolic interactionism, and show how we become aware of our own self through the eyes of others.
Okay, let's start with Adam Smith and sympathy. Seeing ourselves through others' eyes. Smith was influenced by that earlier Erasmian tradition, wasn't he? Emphasizing natural human benevolence and sympathy.
Yes, that inherent human capacity to feel with and for others. In his major work, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, Smith argued that humans are instinctively moved to sympathize with others, to stand in others' shoes, understand their situation, their joys, their sorrows. We naturally try to put ourselves in their place.
Okay.
And crucially, we also expect others to do the same for us. This leads to this continuous reciprocal process of mutual identification. It's a constant back and forth of emotional mirroring.
So through this constant imagining of what others feel, we gain this Almost metacognitive view of ourselves from their perspective.
Exactly. Smith called this the impartial spectator. It's not the view from a specific individual, like your best friend or your parent,
Right.
but rather, as the social psychologist G.H. Mead would later describe it, from a generalized other. It's an internalized sense of how society at large, or a significant group, would judge our actions and feelings.
Like having a judge and jury inside your own head.
Kind of, and this becomes the very basis for self-mastery. We reflect on our own actions and impulses, trying to control them based on how we imagine others will judge us, or how that impartial spectator would react.
So it connects back to Stoic thinking, but with the self playing a much more active, reflective part.
Yes, actively judging itself through this imagined external gaze. Instead of just being told what to do, we anticipate judgment and adjust ourselves proactively.
This is so applicable in the classroom. How do kids learn to share or take turns or resolve conflicts on the playground without a teacher always stepping in?
Well, it's by learning to stand in others' shoes, that's empathy, and imagining how their actions might be perceived by their peers or the teacher, that impartial spectator.
So a child might reach for a toy, then stop, imagining their friend's disappointment or maybe the teacher's gentle disapproval.
Exactly. Encouraging students to reflect on their behavior and its impact on the class community, maybe through circle time discussions where they talk about how actions affect others, or reflecting on group project dynamics that fosters this kind of self-mastery, they internalize those social expectations and start to self-regulate.
Developing an internal social barometer.
Yeah.
Moving to broader perspectives and the divided self. Unlike the Stoics looking to philosophers or Erasmus emphasizing education, Smith believed everyone could be our teacher.
Yes, not just the elite or religious models. It was a profoundly democratic view of learning from interaction. The everyday social environment itself becomes a crucial school for the self.
And he valued commercial enterprise for this reason, because it encouraged interaction.
Highly. It encouraged interaction with a wider range of people, different social classes, professions, maybe even different cultures. It broadened our view of the world and significantly broadened our view of ourselves. The bustling marketplace, full of diverse interactions, became this dynamic, real-world school for the self.
Constantly adapting to others' perspectives.
Right. And Smith saw the modern self as fundamentally divided into two parts.
Okay.
The spectator, who views itself constantly through others' eyes, judging its own performance and feelings as if from the outside, and the agent, the subjective self, aware of its own spontaneous thoughts, feelings, impulses that move it to action.
That concept of a divided self. It sounds strikingly similar to G.H. Mead's later distinction between the I and the me.
It really is. The I being the spontaneous acting self and the me being the socialized self, the internalized attitudes of others. Both share that fundamental idea that individual selves are formed by seeing themselves from the imagined perspective of others.
And you see this division constantly in a classroom. A student thinks about doing something impulsive, maybe yelling out an answer, grabbing something that's the agent, the spontaneous I, but then they consider what the teacher or peers would think. That's the spectator, the me kicking in, internalizing social norms, and then they adjust their behavior, maybe raising their hand instead.
That constant internal dialogue, that dance between impulse and social awareness, is essential for navigating social situations.
This concept also led to unmasking and contemporary relevance, like Erasmus. Smith criticized the nobility.
He did, for valuing superficial flattery and outward show over genuine merit and inner character. He described their elaborate social performances. But by Smith's time, late 18th century, he didn't need to hide behind a mask of folly anymore.
He could be more direct.
Much more direct and analytical in his critique of social falsehoods, reflecting the greater intellectual freedom of the Enlightenment.
And fascinatingly, his observations on how the upper classes perform status, they foreshadow Irving Goffman's work centuries later.
Absolutely. Goffman, in the mid-20th century, writing about the presentation of self in everyday life, actually quoted Smith's detailed descriptions of how noblemen performed their superiority. It highlights how these dynamics of identity tied to performance and impression management remained incredibly relevant.
Some social games really don't change much.
It seems not. Smith's work shows this nuanced, often ironic view of those overly refined performances used to critique and unmask falsity. He essentially extended the Stoic idea of internal control, seeing it happen via this powerful, internalized, impartial spectator.
So this lays the foundation for the interactionist view. Our private, reflective relation to ourselves is inseparable from how others see us.
Exactly. It's the foundation of the social self, which maintains that mute and invisible relation to the private self, that silent internal dialogue about our public presentation.
And significantly, Smith's work also marks the private self becoming more secular, less tied to religious ideas of the soul.
Yes, the focus shifts more towards how we evaluate ourselves through social interaction, through the eyes of our fellow humans, rather than primarily through divine judgment. A move from the sacred to the social as the main mirror for the self.
Okay, so we've arrived at the social self, deeply intertwined with interaction and perception, our inner world shaped by an outer gaze. But what does this mean for our own sense of a unique, private identity today in our contemporary world where we value individualism so highly?
That's the crucial question, isn't it?
We've traveled a long way from ancient masks and philosophical retreats through theatrical metaphors and social mirrors. Now, let's blend it all together. What does this historical journey mean for understanding identity today and how it plays out in everyday life, even in an elementary classroom? How does all this history shape the you that you are right now?
Indeed. Well, connecting it to the bigger picture, the journey highlights just how deeply interconnected our inner and outer selves really are, that internal conversation that defines so much of our modern identity. It's not some pre-social innate thing. It emerges fundamentally from social interaction, from those daily exchanges and reflections. It's like an internal echo chamber built from external sounds.
Which leads us directly to symbolic interactionism, the social process of self. A central idea here, heavily influenced by Smith and refined by people like George Herbert Mead and Irving Goffman, is that the human self literally comes into being and is sustained as an ongoing social process.
Right. It's not something you're born with fully formed. It's something you become through interaction.
And that internal conversation we keep mentioning. Mead described it how?
He argued we become truly reflective selves, aware of our own existence and capable of self-critique, only by acquiring this habit from our earliest social interactions. He famously described it as the I, the spontaneous, unique, acting self, the unpredictable part.
Okay.
Conversing with the me, the socialized self, which has internalized the attitudes and expectations of others, the predictable part. This dynamic interplay, this constant internal back and forth creates our social self, our coherent sense of who we are in relation to others.
And this idea extends to people as role players, which Goffman famously articulated.
Yes, his dramaturgical analysis. We're like actors on a stage, constantly putting on a face or front stage appearance for a specific audience, managing impressions, conforming to expectations.
While reserving other feelings or thoughts for backstage.
Exactly. Where our intended audience can't see us, maybe when we're alone or with very trusted friends or family. And this isn't just formal theater. It's the subtle, everyday social interactions. Think of your curated social media profile as front stage.
Versus maybe a private journal as backstage.
Right. And this is so evident in a classroom. Group projects, playground dynamics, students constantly adjust their performances based on their audience. The teacher, different peer groups, parents watching a play.
A child might be loud with friends, backstage, but quiet when the principal walks by, front stage.
Precisely. So how do teachers help students reflect on these roles? Help them understand the front stage versus backstage of their own behavior and the purpose behind those shifts. This applies powerfully to gender identity, too, where roles are often performed according to cultural rules, consciously or unconsciously.
Helping students recognize these performances and the internal dialogue that goes with them seems like a big step towards self-awareness.
It is. However, there's a crucial point about the depth of the inner self, beyond performance. A potential critique of some interactionist approaches is that they might focus too much on the self as only social performance.
Making it seem a bit shallow.
Potentially, yeah. Lacking psychological depth. If the self is only a series of performances, then what is the self that invests its ego in them, that feels the anxiety of not performing well, or experiences the internal conflict of playing a role that doesn't quite fit? Where does the core you reside?
Good question. So what's the answer?
The answer, as the sources suggest, lies precisely in that internal conversation, the private sense of self that feels like it lies behind our public roles, that core of authenticity. It is this ongoing reflective dialogue with ourselves.
Okay.
It's social through and through because it's built from internalized social interactions and expectations, but it still allows for immense inner life and psychological depth. This is the crucial space where private doubts, conflicting emotions, personal reflections, even that sense of unease about playing a certain role can be articulated and felt without being automatically shared.
The genuine inner experience.
Exactly. This approach highlights a profoundly relational and social self, always located within broader social and historical power relations. Our identities, gender identity, sexual orientation included, are formed within these complex interpersonal and familial scenarios, even when they might clash with societal norms.
And the ability to realize that a role is not entirely comfortable, that feeling of dissonance, comes from that inner reflection, the I challenging the me.
Precisely. That's where the inner conversation becomes critical. For the classroom, while students naturally learn to play roles, fostering psychological depth means creating intentional space for their inner conversations.
How can teachers do that?
Maybe through structured journaling activities where students reflect on feelings, one-on-one check-ins to discuss personal challenges, or encouraging discussions about feelings and motivations behind actions in a safe, non-judgmental space.
So recognizing that a child's performance might hide inner struggles or reflections vital to their identity.
Yes, validating their internal world and giving them tools to explore it.
And speaking of internal worlds, let's look at narrative identity, storytelling ourselves. The idea that we construct our identity by telling stories about ourselves.
Exactly. And the historical roots of this, how we weave experiences into a coherent personal narrative, can be traced way back, from ancient biographies like Aurelius's Meditations,
to Christian autobiographies like Augustine's Confessions, early examples of people making sense of their lives by telling them as stories.
Yes, and these early works show individuals beginning to tell their stories not just in terms of public works or external achievements, but increasingly in terms of their thoughts, feelings, and inner struggles relating to both public and private selves. Even earlier traces in those familiar letters we talked about.
Valuing the inner lived experience as part of one's identity.
A profound shift, and this continues powerfully today, doesn't it? We constantly tell stories about our everyday details, calls, emails, social media posts, conversations. The narrative self thrives through these myriad forms of communication. We're constantly shaping and reshaping our personal history, editing and curating the story of me.
Every time you share an anecdote or write an About Me section,
you're engaging in narrative identity construction. And this narrative self doesn't just relate to the present or past, it also relates profoundly to future images of itself, to what it wants to be.
So it's not just who you were or are, but who you aspire to be.
Exactly. Shaping your actions now based on that desired future narrative. This is crucial for elementary education, tying directly into goal setting and self-concept.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
How do we help students develop their narrative identity then?
Through creative writing assignments about experiences or future selves, sharing personal stories in show and tell or presentations, drawing, dramatic storytelling.
Encouraging reflection on their own growth, challenges, successes, aspirations, helping them actively construct their personal narrative.
Yes, giving them agency over their own story, helping them develop a coherent, evolving sense of self.
Okay. Finally, this whole socio-historical approach to identity we've discussed, it contrasts sharply with cognitive ones that often assume psychological processes are universal, right? Socio-historical creation versus universal cognition.
Right. The idea that how we think about ourselves is the same everywhere, always.
Give us an example.
Well, think of an ancient Greek drama like Sophocles' Oedipus the King. Characters certainly have strong personalities, motives driving the plot. But the Christian cognitive machinery, as classicist Edith Hall calls it, meaning that really deep, nuanced language for describing complex inner struggles, moral dilemmas, psychological motivations, the autonomous individual will that became so central in Renaissance drama and beyond. That kind of rich psychological vocabulary was simply absent.
The characters acted, but the detailed articulation of their inner states wasn't there in the same way.
Not as a separate, private world, no. It reinforces the core argument, the cognitive machinery, the very ability to converse silently with one's own self, that reflective relationship that feels so natural to us now, is fundamentally a socio-historical creation.
Not a biological given.
It emerged not just from biology, but under the profound influence of the trends we've discussed. The public-private split, sincerity, private language, the impartial spectator, our very capacity for deep, nuanced self-reflection, as we understand it in the West, is a product of history.
Wow. So we've taken a deep dive into the historical construction of identity, revealing that our modern Western sense of a unique, private inner self isn't a given, not something we just inherently possess.
Instead, it's this dynamic, evolving product of centuries of thought, social structures, communication practices, new ways of relating to ourselves and others.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? It means your identity and the identities of the young learners you engage with every day. They aren't fixed. They aren't simply found like some pre-written script.
No, they're profoundly dynamic, actively constructed and reconstructed in every interaction, every reflection, every role played, both on the front stage of public life and the backstage of their inner world. Yourself is a constantly evolving story.
And for education, this understanding is incredibly powerful, isn't it? It means we can be more intentional in how we foster self-awareness, empathy, critical thinking in children.
Exactly. We can create environments where students feel safe to explore their inner world through reflection and creative expression, while also navigating their public persona, learning to be authentic and self-controlled within a social context. It's about cultivating the whole person.
Helping them understand that dynamic interplay between inner thoughts and outward social existence.
So maybe a final thought to consider. If the self is largely this socio-historical creation, always in dialogue between our inner thoughts and how others perceive us, what new technologies of the self are emerging in our increasingly digital, interconnected world?
Like social media, VR, AI.
How might they shape the identities of future generations? What new forms of performance and inner conversation will define them?
And what responsibility do we have as educators, as informed citizens, in helping shape those future selves with intention and insight?
Something to think about.